get started today. The clock runs a little bit fast. Welcome to the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, where today we have our third Merienda lecture for the spring semester in 2017. Near the door we have a lot of different literature about programs, upcoming events. We actually have we have scholarship opportunity, a fellowship opportunity. So if you're looking for funding to travel, if you're looking to do any kind of research in Latin America, you can pick that information up on your way out. In addition, we have a whole bunch of literature for the rest of the events that are going to be coming up here for the rest of this semester. So if you haven't been attending, or if you want to attend another Merienda, we have a few more of those coming up here. So please grab that on your way out. If this is your first time attending a Merienda lecture, we typically hold them here on the first Thursday of the month. Same time at 12 p.m. We have food and refreshments here available for you. So please pick our schedule up and attend one of those if you haven't had a chance to do that. Following the presentation today, we're going to have some time for questions as well as comments for our speaker. So please be prepared. And lastly, if you haven't helped yourself to anything for food, please do so. Our next Merienda, just to speak a little bit about that, that's over here, will be with Viviana Grico. She's the Associate Professor of History at UMKC, and she will explore the political culture of Spanish colonialism in Latin America and challenge the traditional notion of resistance and rebellion as a watershed in countries in colonial times. Once again, it's going to be at 12 p.m. in this room here, and we'd be very happy for you to come as well. Lastly, we have a graduate symposium coming up soon on April 3rd. It's going to be from 3 to 6 p.m. It's going to be in the Commons. So if you're a graduate student and if you're doing any sort of research and if you have any kind of proposal for an idea to present, it's based on a red hot research format, so 5 to 7 minute presentations, kind of low key, but meant to be a professional opportunity for you to demonstrate and express your research in this interesting format. So like I said, it'll be at the Commons on April 3rd. If you're interested to present at that event, there's some information for you at the table so you know what you need to do, instructions, who to contact, and what all you need to supply us. And now I'd like to go ahead, lastly, sorry, I forgot our most important thing. So this Sunday, Julia Alvarez is going to be coming to speak. She's the author of 19 books, 3 books of poetry, and she's the author of In a Time of the Butterflies, which has been the NEA Big Read selection that the Lawrence community has been reading. Maybe you've seen that around. So she's going to be coming. We're very lucky to have her. She's going to be at the Lead Center, I believe, at 7 o'clock, and she'll be speaking from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Like I said, at the Lead Center. It's open to the public, it's free, so you can invite friends, family, colleagues to that event. It should be really great, and like I said, it's really lucky for us to have her here as part of the grant that we've been involved in with the Lawrence Public Library and the KU Library. So please do try to come to that. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. This is Clara Irazábal, and she's the Director of Latino Studies Program and the Professor of Planning with tenure in the Department of Architecture, Urban Planning, and Design at UMKC. Before joining UMKC in the fall of 2016, she was the Latin Lab Director and Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University in New York City. She got her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and has 2 master's degrees. In her research and teaching, she explores the interactions of culture, politics, and placemaking and their impact on community development and socio-spatial justice in Latin American cities and Latinx immigrant communities. And there's a fuller bio of some of the publications there in front of you as well. But without further ado, speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Boa tarde. Buenas tardes. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming out. I know that you are all very busy. People are very busy in university settings, but this is the type of spaces that I cherish the most in university. So we need to make room for this, and I certainly appreciate to be able here to share my work with you today. This is actually work that is a result of engagement with students, because I took students from the master program of urban planning at Columbia University in the city of New York to Brazil a couple of months ago. I just recently moved to UMKC for the start of this academic year, and some of the observations in here came out of that trip. I also had interns, Brazilian interns, spending the summer with me in New York doing research, and those are the ones, Luisa, Daniela, and Renata, that also assisted with the research. As the title suggests, I'm going to be talking about housing, social movements, and restorative justice in Brazil, and how they are enacting something that I'm calling the counter land grabbing. And they are the Precariat, and I'll explain all of that in more detail in a couple of minutes. So this is what I want to share with you this afternoon. What is land grabbing, and why am I calling this particular thing that the social housing movement is doing counter land grabbing instead? Who are they? Who are the members of the social housing movements, the Precariat? And what are they responding to? And that is the housing deficit that exists in Brazil and that they are the victims of. How do they go about doing that? What rationale they use to justify the occupation of buildings and lands that they promote? It's the laws that exist in Brazil, and you will see how progressive those laws are and how they consider, for example, the right to housing as a human right, as a right. And the means that they use, I claim it's a process of restorative justice, a different type of justice that is not the punitive justice that is applied, for example, regularly in American courts, but something else. There's a toolkit of planning instruments that they have at hand and that they have mobilized in order to promote this right to housing. We'll discuss some of that, and the many obstacles that they still face, and how is it that some of them can be overcome perhaps by a lot of work on their part and Brazilians in general, but also by support by the international community as well. So I will touch also on our responsibilities as the academic sector on that in my final thoughts. So let's move it along. First, a little bit of an orientation for people that are not very familiar with the area. We have South America here, Brazil in white. One of the southern states is the state of Sao Paulo, and in there the largest of its cities is Sao Paulo city. Sao Paulo is one of the largest metropolises in the world. It has more than 20 million inhabitants already, perhaps a lot more than that because of the informal settlements that are usually undercounted. So this is what it is, Sao Paulo, near the coast, but not quite at that. And this is the greater metropolitan area of Sao Paulo. So what is land grabbing? Land grabbing is the accumulation of large tracts of lands. And that has existed in Brazil and in Latin America since colonial times, right? The empires of Spain, and in the case of Brazil, the empire of Portugal, grabbed the entire continent during colonial times. The Portuguese in Brazil actually used a very clever method. They put land titles that they created, fake land titles, in boxes together with crickets, so that crickets ate at them and made them look as if they were old. And in that manner, they claimed that they had had these titles forever, that they had had it for a long time, and they had just been recently created. So talk about fake news. Well, they are not an invention of the current administration. So that's during colonial times. But then in more modern times, I'm trying to learn how to operate this. In more modern times, we have had large multinational corporations and even countries, including the United States, but also China and India and Britain and others, that are land grabbing enormous pieces of land in Brazil and other countries around the world, and in particular in Latin America. 11% of the continental area of Brazil is supposed to be in the hand of multinational corporations that are trying to, cultivate mono-cultivation of things for, different type of fuel and things like that. And then what we see since the 80s to the present moment is the rising up of social movements in Brazil, starting with the landless movement of peasants in rural areas of Brazil trying to counteract the oligopoly of land in the hands of very few families in Brazil that had destituted them altogether. So they grab land and they try to redress the ownership of it so that it serves larger groups of people and can restore some of the opportunities that they had to own land and to cultivate land, to put land in the hands of the workers of the land. This is what has been happening, and more recently, those rural movements started to take place also in urban areas. The urban branches of those movements are the ones that we are going to be referring to in this presentation. There are many negative impacts to the land grabbing that has been taking place since colonial time. It creates land and housing insecurity because it used to be that you had small farmers with small plots of land, so land was more equitably distributed across many, many hands, and when you take that off the hands of the people, then these people do not have a way of sustaining themselves any longer. Displacement, it creates displacement, it creates dispossession. Harvey would say accumulation by dispossession that has been going on for centuries in the continent. Unemployment, underemployment of local people, and these are usually negotiations that happen behind closed doors in manners that are not democratic and people do not have any way of participating in. And it's very negative for an environmental perspective because monocultivation destroys the capacity of soils very rapidly. And it's also very bad for labor because the people that are put to work these lands now in the hands of very few people are usually very badly paid, if at all, and work under very bad conditions. So it's an instance in these newer ways of land grabbing that are happening in Brazil at the moment. It's an instance of neocolonialism, we could argue, because it's a renewed economic imperialism of developed countries and BRICS countries, again, India and China and Russia, over developing nations. And Brazil, unfortunately, it's a victim here. On the flip of the coin, we have the very positive aspects of the counter land grabbing that the social housing movements are enacting in Brazil since the 80s. It puts land and housing in the hands of much larger numbers of people, creating tenure security. It employs local people. It creates just processes of negotiation between investors and governments, what I'm calling restorative justice, and I'll explain in more detail in a couple of minutes. These are processes that happens with proper local consultation and compensation for land. The lands that are occupied, the owners are compensated for, as we will see in a couple of examples. It promotes more environmental stewardship and sustainable agriculture, and it is the reverse process of neocolonialism, and it instills improved sovereignty, the right to self-decide and enact on development by the people that live there in the first place. This is the greater Sao Paulo metropolitan region, Sao Paulo city in the middle of it, and in red, the occupations that the roofless workers movement, the one that I'm focusing on, has done recently in Sao Paulo and some of the neighboring municipalities. And if you can appreciate in here, most of the occupations they do is off land, vacant land, in the periphery of the urbanized area that you see in gray here, right? And they do that as a strategy of their own that is different from other social housing movements that are instead preferring to occupy buildings in the central area of the city. They do occupations in the periphery because they claim that it is in there that they have their social base of their movement. People that are members of the movement come from those peripheral settlements, usually informal settlements, favelas, and the sort that are in the periphery of the urbanized area. And by occupying land there and potentially flipping that land to be converted into social housing, they put services, they bring services to the larger context in there. These squatter settlements that are around usually don't have proper sanitation, proper public transportation or services of other sorts, whereas when they are successful in converting these occupations into housing, they usually bring those services that then go beyond the ones that are solely for the residents themselves. And this is how it looks like. This is a recent occupation. It's called Villa Palestina, Nova Palestina, that is New Palestine. They also have a democratic process for selecting the names of these new settlements, and usually those names are very meaningful, of groups that they want to express solidarity towards, or they want to emulate. In the case of Palestine, it's pretty evident that they would support, the Palestinians and are critical of the process of occupations of their territory in Israel. And they do this in a very organized manner. They have a social organization in committees, the different committees that refers to food production and distribution, or the spatial organization in the area that they will be occupying, or water and transportation and security, et cetera, whatever is relevant for the organization of the community. They have committees that would be the responsibles for taking matters, running matters, managing those aspects of the settlement. But who are they? Who are these people that are the members of these social housing movements? Usually, people of color and certainly low-income people. The poorest of the poor, material-wise, in Brazil are the ones that are members of this social housing movement. Brazil have a way of thinking about the social hierarchy in brackets of minimum wages. So the 0 to 3 minimum wage bracket, which is something on which not even an individual can survive in Brazil, let alone a family, is the bulk from which members of the social housing movements come from. And they are usually, as you can appreciate in the picture, people of color. And Brazil has many shades of racial categorization of their people, from black to all shades of brown, that you would be surprised. There's a Brazilian reader that will have a chapter on that, with more than 100 categories of races that people self-describe themselves with in the census in Brazil. But people of color are the ones that compose the movement. And in here you see a coalition, a march in which a coalition of these movements come together to express, support for the right to housing that is part of the constitution, the federal constitution of the country. And you can see that there are plenty of them. In here you have, excuse me. You have a number of logos for the different social housing movements, and I'm referring particularly to the Movimento dos Trabalhadores Sem Teto, the roofless workers movement in Brazil, which might be perhaps the largest urban movement focusing on housing. And they focus on housing as a way of focusing on urban matters in general. Housing as a platform by which you have access to better schooling and better health opportunities and all sorts of other functions and amenity. Rather, housing as the vehicle for the realization of the right to the city, if you wished, which is something that is very explicit as well in the legislation of Brazil. And what is the proletariat versus the precariat? Karl Marx taught us what the proletariat was. People that were wage earners and that had to sell their labor to live. The capitalists own the means of production. Whomever does not own the means of production is, part of the proletariat. They have to earn their salary, their wages, but they can have certain level of stability doing that, even if conditions are not the greatest. What we are seeing now with this new social class that has come about in recent years, that has been named the Precariat, is the chronically underemployed or unemployed altogether, or the cyclically underemployed in manners that have no job security whatsoever, and therefore no sense of stability or capacity to make plans for the future or to even realize any type of future. So if we came used to looking at the social hierarchy, the socioeconomic hierarchy of societies around the world in these terms that the pyramid expresses here, with the proletariat at the bottom and a very large class, and then a squeezed middle class in the middle, and the 1%, as it was called here in the United States during the Occupy movement, at the top. What we see now with the Precariat is that, well, they're not even to be seen. They are below the pyramid altogether. And it is a way of expressing that they have been invisibilized, that they are invisibilized in many occasions, disposed of as if they were not fully human. And there are a lot of people that have started to philosophize about this matter. For example, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben called them the homo saucer. And this comes from the Latin word of accursed man, something that came about in Roman law. During the Roman Empire, if a person was accused of a crime, he or she could be killed by anybody with total immunity, with no consequence whatsoever. So his or her worth was reduced to something less than an animal altogether. It could be, hunted like a fox, and that's what it refers to, which is also being named bare life. Humans stripped of their humanity altogether, bodies stripped of their human and political dignity. In Brazil's Precariats, that's what we see, a non-fully human, non-fully political body, not human being, a non-citizen, or at best a sub-citizens. These are subjects that are stripped of their right, and because of that, they are not supported in their claims when they claim their rights of the Constitution, for example, the right to housing. They are not deemed by the people representatives of the law in the courts, in the legislative system in Brazil, as worth subjects for the deliverance of those types of rights. And they are sometimes persecuted, tortured, disappeared, and killed in many instances, as if they were less than humans. But what are they responding to when they organized in social movement? So if a person can be deemed bare life, you can do that with a single individual or a bunch of them. But if they organize and grow in numbers by the thousands, if not the million, it's much harder to dismiss them. And you will have to find a way of dealing with that, if not negotiating with the movement altogether. So they organize to overcome their categorization as homo saucers or bare life. And they organize to respond to this enormous deficit that exists in Brazil with regards to housing, that is both a quantitative and a qualitative deficit. In quantitative terms, some of the numbers are expressed here. In Brazil, there is a deficit of more than 6 million units, and 83% or more of that deficit accrues to this bracket of class that is between 0 and 3 minimum wages. So the poorest of the poor are the ones that are lacking housing the most, evidently. But the worst part of this, that is kind of evident, is that the social housing programs put out by the government that are supposed to be serving the poorest of the poor are not reaching that level of poverty. They are creating public housing, and there have been a lot of creation of public housing recently in Brazil, but they are at a higher level of affordability. In the state of Sao Paulo, there is more than 1 million housing in the quantitative deficit. Most of it accrued to this lowest rank of the social hierarchy. And then in the greater Sao Paulo area, the one that we're looking at, more than 500,000 units are needed. And this grows by the year as you have also more people to serve and the deficit is not fully filled out in previous years. And almost 80% of that need is in this bracket of 0 to 3 minimum wages. You also have a qualitative aspect to this matter, and all of the members of the social housing movements accrue one or more than one of these conditions. Their house that they currently occupy is very precarious, meaning that it might not be sturdy enough to support, a heavy rain. Usually you have seasonal problems of housing in Brazil because when the heavy rains come every year, and they are heavier every year because of climate conditions, the climate change condition, it puts a lot of people into homeless. So you have that, and then you have cohabitation where you have more than one nuclear family living in a shelter because they the kids have kids of their own, but they don't have anywhere to go. They need to cohabit with their parents and their grandparents, etc., not out of choice, but out of need, which is different. And excessive rent burden when you're paying a lot for rent and you cannot afford that, so you are at the verge of becoming homeless at any time. And then overcrowded rented units is something that the studies in Brazil also take a look at, because when you rent a house, you don't have any capacity to do transformations to that unit in manners that might accommodate better your household. So if you have greater needs, for example, having kids, you will have to look at housing elsewhere, and that also creates enormous constraints for families that have low economic resources. And so how do they construct a justification for telling the rest of the society that they have a reason to occupy buildings and lands that are vacant or underutilized, but that might belong to somebody else? Private property occupation. They base their claim in the Federal Constitution of Brazil and in a number of other laws at a lower level. The Federal Constitution, enacted in 1982, says that property shall serve a social function. How wonderful thing to say of property, that private property is not an absolute right. We actually have here, when in the United States there is zoning that prevents you from constructing above a certain height level, or to have a certain bulk to a building and not go beyond a floor area ratio that is determined, or that you have to preserve a certain space in front of your building, a setback or side backs and things like that. All of those are constraints over private property. But this goes farther than that and says the private property needs to serve a social function. So we as a society need to be better off by the use that you have of your private property. And if you don't put your private property to a social services, then the state can intervene and promote that you do so, and ultimately force you to do so. And the way they go about is by saying that the state shall require from the owner of an underused or vacant property the promotion of its proper utilization under penalty of expropriation. And it is not that the Brazilian government is going about expropriating everybody's private property, but that they notify owners, listen, you have this vacant property, you have had it for a number of years, I will give you 5 more years to use it for certain purposes that have a sense of a social function. So you can build residences or offices or a shopping mall, but you have to put it to use. If you don't put it to use, you can also sell it for a good price and then have another person put it to use, but you cannot have it vacant forever, just fattening it, expecting for a better time to speculate over it. Is putting a cap on speculation of the real estate market, that we would be all better off if the United States were to do something similar, right? So that's in the Constitution. And then you have the Statute of the City, that is also a federal legislation that came about as a result of an urban reform movement that was called like that, urban reform, in the 80s, to promote the right to the city. So in the Statute of the City, they have the right to decent housing. It's a right. So the state is mandated to enact that right for all Brazilian citizens, independently of their social class. And then you have the prevalence of common interest over individual property rights. It's again asserting the need stated at the Constitution that all property needs to serve a social function. So as you can appreciate, legislation is very, very progressive in the case of Brazil. Unfortunately, there is still an enormous gap between the word or the law on the one hand and the implementation of the law in the other. And the missing link is usually the judges that are still occupying important positions in courts that do not see for the implementation on what is in the law, but that continue to give prevalence to the absolute right of property owners, private property owners. But there is indeed a lot of reasons to create a justification about the right to housing. And they, I think the way they do that, by occupying lands and occupying buildings, they are presenting to us, in the field of urban planning in particular, a new model of doing things, of creating transformation in the city, directing transformation in the city, which is restorative justice. So let me tell you what I'm arguing for here. When we study planning, we say that there are many models of going about doing decision making about the city. Perhaps the most prevalent of the models is that which is called rational planning, which is supposed to pretty much follow the scientific model, right? You have a problem, you create a statement of the problem, and then you have hypotheses that will respond to that problem. If you have transportation, you need transportation in the city, you come about different ways of improving transportation in the city, you try out the models, you create simulations to see how they pan out, and then you compare them, the pros and cons, and ultimately make a decision that supposedly is more rational because you have considered all the information available, you have run all the simulations that will present you different options, and you ultimately selected the ones that was more cost effective. So it's rational altogether. It makes a lot of sense to preserve that type of model, but what people started to realize is that it didn't necessarily deliver justice. Sometimes it created a lot more injustice because in its idea of being effective, it didn't consider matters of equity. You can be very effective, but promoting, greater benefit for the rich, as opposed to thinking about the real needs of the poorest of the poor. So this wasn't serving planning very well, and people came about the idea of, wait, why don't we then conceive of a model that is more participatory? Let's bring everybody to the table, and let's make certain that people that are poor, people that are misrepresented or underrepresented are here too, so that we can collectively create consensus or wrestle with questions to bring about something that is more democratic. So democracy, the process of decision making, was what it was important here. But it turns out that in the implementation of a so-called democratic model, what we find in many instances is people getting together in wealthy communities to enact, for example, exclusionary zoning, preventing multifamily housing, for example, to be built in the city. I don't know if it happens here in Kansas City, but in California, it's everywhere to see that people come together and democratically vote to prevent multifamily housing in a city. What that is a coding word of going about preventing low-income people and people of color to come to very white communities, white and wealthier communities. So you can be very democratic. Through democracy, you can not only sustain the status quo, but sometimes even make it worse from the point of view of justice. So again, a lot of criticism to this model, and other people came about and say, well, why don't we create a model that is fully advocacy for the poor and advocacy for the environment? And in here, what we will focus on would be outcomes. It doesn't matter that much necessarily the process for decision making, but what matters the most is that the results that you get really improve the life conditions of people at the bottom. Well, as I bet you're already thinking, there are limitations to each of these models, and people have been very expressive to say, well, the rational model is not serving us because there is no concern for excuse me. No. There is no concern for democracy and equity here, but if we are more democratic and focus on process, we don't have a sense of what results. The results could be actually adverse to equity. But if we focus on result instead, we might do away with democracy altogether, because you sometimes have to impose something that will bring about more justice, even if it goes against the will of the majority that would support more exclusionary policies and practices in place. And all of this limitation is what I think restorative justice can overcome to a great extent. So if you have more participatory processes and more advocacy processes, and you combine the two, you will get restorative justice. And in the case of the social housing movement, it looks more or less like this. You have, Jesus, this is very weird. Gosh. You have an injustice to start with, which is the fact that the deficit of housing is focused in these poorest of the poor, 0 to 3 minimum wages, and then they organize and they occupy a land in the periphery of the city, and by doing that, they force the main stakeholders to the table to negotiate. When they occupy the land, they do that with a lot of research on the land. They don't just occupy any piece of land that is vacant, but land that they have done research on to prove that, for example, is behind in paying taxes to the city, and it's been vacant for a while and there's no plan for it, so it's not serving its social function. So by occupying it, they force the landowner to come to the table together with the city representative, the mayor or whomever else, and this landowner needs to come to terms with the fact that he's not putting his land to a social services. So he either needs to pay a lot of money on previous taxes on it and create a project altogether, or sell it. And in that case, oftentimes, he or she sells it to the city, and the city then promotes the right to housing that it is mandated to deliver on. because the community is already organized and usually works together with solidaristic architects and planners that have put together a plan, co-designed a plan for a good project for that land. So everybody gains in the process because collective rights are put on top of individual rights, and everybody recognizes their responsibility and also their opportunity to overcome injustice by their contributions. And they make agreements, and ultimately the justice is restored. More people are served with the right to social housing. The land is put to a social service. The city enacts the right to housing, and everybody is in better terms than when they started off. That's restorative justice. How do they go about producing some of these victories that they have had? They use planning tools, and I'm going to focus on 4 that I think are perhaps the most relevant, the most productive of them all. Zoning, taxation, the social housing program the national government has in place, and then socially responsible professionals like you and I when they contribute to these social housing movements and their causes. So there is a very intriguing zoning category that Brazil created that they call ZEIS, Zonas Especiais de Interesse Social, Spatial Zone of Social Interest. And they have categorized these different vacant and underutilized spaces in the city and their different types, and how is it that they could be converted into social housing. For example, category 1 here, regularization of land occupied by self-built settlements. These type of settlements that you see in the photo are zoned in manners in which speculation is prevented within. So they are sustained as enclaves in which social housing, more affordable housing, can take place without the intervening hand of the speculative real estate market. That's one way of going about. And one that I'm going to present a study from is this 4th one. Lots in protected areas with potential to be urbanized. As the city grows, there are at some point, there is the need to expand onto natural or agricultural areas. But the way you go about doing that can perhaps, if done well, maintain a good balance, a good ecological balance for the entire city. This is what it is about. In this case that you saw earlier, Villa Nova Palestina, the New Palestine land, is settled in a protected area. So the regulation stated that only 10% of that area could be occupied, but through negotiations, as the one that I discussed before, the new Plano Director, the new master plan of the city, transformed this area in ZEIS 4, that it can have 30% occupation. And it turns out that the occupation that it has turned the new residents as the new stewards of the areas that are to be protected. They realize the importance of maintaining the protection of the 70% of the land that they have occupied, so that they can have good quality of life, access to green areas and the support of the river basin that is around that will provide good quality air and water for the community. So in here, again, some numbers for these: 300,000 square meters, more than 8,000 people that have been served in this community that the government has already decided to support a project for and build social housing there. The second of those instruments, of the 4 that I'll discuss rapidly, is taxation. And they have come about this very creative way of progressively going about that, in which the first 5 years for, Jesus, I'm not gonna do this again. They notify people that have vacant properties, either buildings or lands. They say, listen, you'll have 5 more years to put this to a social function as the Constitution mandates you to do. If they don't do that, in the process, they receive progressive taxation. They need to pay more taxes the more they delay that transformation of their land until they can face expropriation. So they have 10 years to come themselves to be in order with the law. So it's not something that is extremely violent at all against landowners. They have more than enough provision to profit from their private property in this manner. And you see there are tons of spaces in the city of Sao Paulo alone, let alone the growing metropolitan area, on which to produce more housing and social housing at that, if those properties were put into use. So this is in a very rough estimate, at least 80,000 or 81,000 units could be very rapidly provided for if those properties were converted with a sense of a social function in Sao Paulo. The third of the instruments is this very big national housing program that Brazil has instituted, Minha Casa Minha Vida, My Home, My Life, by which it has created almost 2 million new units of housing, serving poor people, but not necessarily in this lowest of brackets of 0 to 3 minimum wages, unless it is put to use in conjunction with the community. So there is a small fraction of this Minha Casa Minha Vida program that works collectively with community groups and with collectives to put projects together, to co-design projects together, and that part of the program is called entidades. Unfortunately, in the metropolitan area, only less than 4% of the budget of Minha Casa Minha Vida, or excuse me, less than 1% of the budget and less than 4% of the housing produced by Minha Casa Minha Vida has been this type of housing that have come about as a result of negotiations with communities themselves, as opposed to having these very large development corporations, very large firms, put this project together, which are usually very homogeneous, of bad build quality, in very far away localities, disconnected from centers of jobs and things like that. So those things haven't been done very well, but the projects that have been done with communities are usually much better in terms of quality, in terms of distribution of the spatial layout, in terms of connections with jobs and public transportation. And they also facilitate not only the co-design, but also the co-build of these projects. So you have members of the movement here, and this is a logo of the workers, the roofless workers movement, being part of the workers that are putting together these buildings that they themselves design, and therefore are, of much better quality, larger apartments, etc., than the ones put together by the large development firms by themselves. And then fourth and lastly, the socially responsible professionals. And we have a lot of them in Brazil, but not enough, not sufficiently to give account to the type of deficit that they need to be responding to. These are professionals that put their services at the service of the communities to bring about projects that are more multifunctional, are not solely residential, because the residential projects create ghettos disconnected from the amenities that needs to be put in place for a neighborhood to function. And in here you have open spaces, public transportation, better localization of the project, near centers for education and jobs, etc. And it makes an enormous difference in the quality of life of the residents and in the sustainability of the projects. Okay, so it all looks very doable, And it has been put to good use with very interesting projects to highlight as successful cases, but there are many obstacles still to be faced for this to be fully blown in the manner that is needed. The first one is the consideration of land exclusively as a commodity, as opposed to land as a public good or as a common good that needs to be looked at and dealt with also by its use value and not exclusively by its exchange value. If we don't see land that is at the heart of the right to the city, in its use value, what it can bring to us in terms of quality of life and the promotion of well-being for all in society, independently of our socioeconomic class, then we won't have much progress, if any progress at all, in creating a more just society. Another barrier is the insufficient political power, unfortunately, that the movement have had, even when they are by the millions, not only the members of the movement themselves, but their allies in society. They haven't necessarily trickled up in the hierarchies of power in Brazil in manners to have proper representation in the upper skeleton of the decision-making system that can deliver the right to housing and the right to the city in Brazil. So that needs to be done yet. And then the criminalization and the dehumanization of the members of the movements that, as I say, are dealt with on a regular basis as if they were bare life. They linked from their humanity altogether. And more recently, for example, this is recent news, justice arrests members of landless movement based on anti-terrorist law. So now they are also deemed as terrorists. The new language in vogue, and not only in Brazil, but around the world, very much here, and treated as such, and therefore discrediting the justification that they have for their claims that is rooted in the Constitution. And more recently, Brazil's political economic crisis. It's an enormous economic crisis, but worse than that, it's a political crisis where Brazil is lacking, the leaders that are capable of bringing about a more equitable society out of the mess the country is in at the moment. So a lot of work ahead for the movement, for Brazilians in general, and for us as well. There's need to protect and continue claiming the constitutional rights. Unfortunately, the very constitution in Brazil is at risk at the moment because there have been intent of changing the constitutions altogether. Put the government's tools into action. The government have master plans, and the master plan for Sao Paulo is a particularly good one that can deliver a lot in terms of social housing. Reinstate and expand Minha Casa Minha Vida, but this piece that works with communities that is called entidades in particular. Empower social housing movement, realizing that they are not criminals, that they are not terrorists, and that they have a right in a democratic society to express themselves and to actually claim for their rights. And promote and demand solidarity and reconciliation so that we can see justice in a different light and through a different process. We are very used to this rivalry or contestataриan way of going about justice, in which the more powerful prevails. The one that can do the best, make the best argument, which is really the one that can pay the more expensive lawyer, can win in court. And instead of that, a different way in which we all recognize the way that we're participant in the injustices that exist in society today, and as such, we also have responsibilities to overcome them together. Expand research and advocacy, because the more we expose this through research and advocate for transformation, the greater the possibilities for the movement themselves, and the good legislators and decision makers in the executive government can have tools to demonstrate why it is important to promote the right to housing and the right to the city, and reform professional education to promote social responsibility. Sometimes we focus too much on the technical aspects, on how to design housing and how to design neighborhoods, whereas it would be important to realize that we need to work more with communities that know best what is it that they are missing and how they can have better conditions of living, and promote that type of order that will bring about greater equity in our cities, as opposed to maintaining the status quo where the 1% continues to grab all of the wealth that is produced by the community. So I think restorative justice is indeed can indeed become a new paradigm or process of planning that can deliver more emancipatory results for everybody around, because it tackles structural poverty and inequality. It makes visible what has been invisible. This precariat has been invisibilized. They are being tried to become invisibilized. But these processes bring them to the fore, incentivize everybody to participate in restoring justice, and demands justice in both processes and outcomes, creates a society that is both more democratic but also more just at the end. In this case, these are processes that have been done by the poor and for the poor. So we can consider how is it that we can best become allies of these processes. And it's rooted still in the Brazilian constitution and law so far, and until they are transformed, there is a good and very legal rationale to be invested in this type of struggles. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, comments?
Yes.
Do you see any difference between the occupations conducted by the ruthless movement and the establishment of the favelas, the Brazilian shanty-towns, in the first half of the 20th century? Because I was just wondering when this process of land grabbing by the Precariat started in Brazil. Do you see any difference between the establishment of the favelas and these occupations?
Yes, I think that generally the process of favela production is more organic, and it's due from the accumulation of many individual efforts of building up a unit of shelter for a particular household, and therefore they end up usually with no sense of organization in the larger perspective of the settlement. And that creates a lot of difficulties for putting together infrastructure after the fact that they have been built. Putting infrastructure on top of a favela that was built organically without a plan makes it a lot more complicated technically and also costly than what these movements are proposing to do, because it's a much more organized effort that has a better sense of a layout, of a resulting potential layout that it can have, and in that sense reduces the cost of infrastructure and improves the opportunities to serve the community with better, utilities and connections, etc. And at the same time, it also has a political intent. It is not just the provision of housing, but also the transformation of the heart of a society, or the social contract, if you wished. The recognition that the well-being of a society at large comes about through greater solidarity across classes, because the destiny is ultimately one that ties all residents together, as opposed to each one solving piece by piece its own individual need of housing. So much so, it has a political intent that it is often the case that members of the movement that obtain housing through their participation in the movement continue to be activists of the movement because they realize that they were not in it just to solve their individual problem, but actually to create this transformation that could reach everybody else.
We have time for one more question. I know that we're a little bit behind 12 o'clock, so if other people do want to stay after and ask a few more questions, we can do that too. But did you?
I don't want to preempt anybody else. Well, I guess my question is about like the dilemma of the Brazilian legal system. The Constitution expresses a lot of ideals. It's a very idealistic constitution, like many Latin American constitutions are. It's not really a sort of bare bones working document by which things get done. It expressed a lot of ideals that came out of the redemocratization process in the 1980s, and as such, it's an unfinished product. And the legal system is notoriously inefficient in Brazil. And I think the combination of that inefficient legal system and this idealistic and difficult to execute constitution as a roadmap for how society gets run raises costs for everybody. Particularly it raises costs for like real estate developers to provide housing not for the bottom parts of society, but for all parts of society. And that means I think there are housing shortages in the middle for the middle class in Brazil. There's housing shortages for Class B, Class C houses too. And consequently, and a lot of that has to do with scarce land, difficult legal system, high cost of development. And what that means is that those classes kind of occupy space that in a more efficient, less costly system would have been occupied by people on the lower rungs. So I guess my question to you is that, how much of the housing crisis among like the precariat is because of shortage of housings of people who are well off, who basically crowd out the least advantaged people of society because there's no housing for them either.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. There's a deficit of housing across the society, but if you pay notice to the percentages in the quantitative numbers of that Brazil has, it really concentrates in the 0 to 3 minimum wage bracket. So it's not comparable.
It's not like middle class people don't have houses, but there are houses that they aspire to more, but that's what they have. And
but the other cause, I think, of this crunch is the speculation that has grown tremendously since the mega events, and it's particularly appreciative in Rio de Janeiro, for example, that had both the soccer games and the Olympics very recently, and the prices came to be at a level that at some points for certain real estate pieces, the prices were higher than in New York City, in Manhattan. So it was ridiculously out of hand with the level of affordability that the regular Brazilian person would have. So that creates also a sense of lack of hope and opportunity for all social classes, as you're saying. And it is the middle class in particular, the one that is being squeezed out of Rio de Janeiro altogether, the more rapidly I sense because of these conditions. So this idea of putting the property to a social function and not having it vacant or underutilized indefinitely, perhaps we're expecting for even better conditions to sell out, I think is an appropriate cap to put into untapped speculation.
Let's have another round of applause for speakers.
Yes, thank you.